Leonardo pulled off two enormous jokes on history.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Minds Against Dogma, our podcast. We are filming this around Leonardo da Vinci's birthday, and we thought who better to feature in a Minds Against Dogma mad podcast episode than the inventor, the visionary, the creative genius, the scientist, the artist, who was so out of this world in some of his inventions and ideas, and definitely ahead of his time. And who better to speak about Leonardo da Vinci with than the experts, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. I call them the Da Vinci whisperers because they dedicated a significant portion of their lives to research him and his life and his work. They are historical researchers and authors of a number of books on historical subjects and religious subjects. Your first book is actually The Turin Shroud, how Leonardo da Vinci fooled history, your first book together. One of your very well-known books is The Templar Revelation, the book on which Dan Brown based his Da Vinci Code, according to the man himself, according to his mention of that during the lawsuit with the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And you also got cameo roles in the movie in the Da Vinci Code. People can see you in bus number 11 there. And I know, Lynn, one of your other books, Ron Howard wanted to feature one of your other books, Mary Magdalene, in the movie that's not necessarily featured in the book. One of my favorite, I mean, probably my favorite nonfiction book is The Forbidden Universe, especially the part about the biology and evolution. And that's my favorite chapter. So I recommend that book very often. Your latest book is When God Had a Wife, which for some reason on some phones, the autocorrect feature is changing into When God Had Wi-Fi. So I guess even for the AI, it's a bit too much of a controversial subject. So it's When God Had Wi-Fi. Sounds like a better replacement in their mind. And you also have been publishing research features twice a month on your Patreon page, which we're going to show at the end of the podcast. And you have a few features that I want to talk about that are coming on soon. So I would advise anyone to go check your Patreon page. You're gonna soon have your own 100, I think, Patreon feature anniversary, which is absolutely phenomenal. You've been doing it, like, you started during the pandemic, I remember that, and you're still going strong with the feature on Patreon. So before I give the floor to you, so to say, I would like to mention as a disclaimer, although I'm not sure disclaimer for what, but just for the sake of transparency, that we've been close friends for 13 years. Is going to be 13 years this year and coming up soon. So it's called a friend anniversary. It's something I didn't know until recently. So it's been 13 years. We met in London through a concatenation of odd circumstances. And I remember I was so impressed with reading the chapter from Forbidden Universe, the chapter about cosmology, which is one of my fields. I was so impressed with the way you explain it in layperson terms and in such an engaging manner. So we've been friends for 13 years, and we haven't collaborated like this before. We collaborated on a book and a few features. But this is the first time we're doing a podcast together about Leonardo da Vinci. So now I want to ask you, why would you think that Leonardo da Vinci is like one of the perfect figures to feature in a Minds Against Dogma podcast?
Well, I've been thinking about this curiously enough. No, the very word dogma implies limits. It implies a belief that's set in stone, or a series of beliefs that are set in stone and you can't change it. And Leonardo da Vinci was the opposite, the complete opposite of that. He embodied limitless thinking. There was no limits, nothing was set in stone as far as he was concerned. Everything was a challenge. And if somebody said, I'm sorry, this is the way it's always been done, that was the moment which he said, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to do it another way, or I'm going to look for another way to do it. And I'm going to take it apart, whatever it is, and see how it fits together. So he was the perfect anti-dogma character.
And that's dogma in, whichever way you look at dogma, in any way you apply it. Obviously, it's usually used in a religious sense. He was very much, he lived in a severely religious time. You were very restricted in your belief, but he challenged that. He went against that. He was very critical of the church, as far as you could get away with in his time. He didn't go with the dogmas of science of his time, because that was, back in the 15th century, everything was about, it was all based on Aristotle and his ancient way of doing science, that always appealed to authority. And although he kind of started off that way, he very quickly got into this thing of, no, you don't just accept the authority of the people that have written the books. You don't appeal to authority all that. You use your own eyes and intelligence, and you study nature. So he moved from that mindset, the very rigid Aristotle mindset, into basically you have to observe and experiment, the foundations of science as we know it. So he challenged that dogma. But he challenged the dogma of anything. He even, challenged the way art was supposed to be done. When he began art, artists were just craftsmen in the same way that a carpenter was. They just did produce the work that they were told to produce. But he actually challenged that, and is the first artist in the modern sense of the word that used art as a means of self-expression, a visual equivalent of poetry. So he challenged those attitudes, just everything, whatever you came up against, he questioned it.
And in doing that, he elevated the whole, if you like, concept and practice of art, because before he came along, as Clive more or less said, that basically artists were workmen, were artisans. And afterwards, he made it into a proper art, something elevated and noble and incredible. So you can't you don't look at Leonardo da Vinci and think there's a workman. You look at him and think there's a great artist, and he was, in a sense, the first of the great artists, simply because anything that he got involved in, he pushed the limits. So anything had its own rules, and therefore it's sort of dogma. He pushed and pushed and pushed until he just burst through them.
And that affects his personal life as well. He didn't go. He didn't go with the norms, shall we say?
So the first one and the most obvious one, and we're gonna be speaking about this with some clear examples from his work, was, unlike some people would expect, because he did religious painting, he was actually a heretic, and this is kind of like our heretical reunion, or the reunion of the heretics. We're going to be speaking about Leonardo da Vinci in that sense, and we're going to show some examples. As you said, the second one was his scientific mind, and this is something that I would like to focus on, and we are going to look at some of his inventions and some of his notes that were way ahead of their time. And the art as well, the art as was seen after Leonardo and before Leonardo. But there was also another point in which he was against a dogmatic view, and I'm talking about social dogmas and political dogmas. So speak a little bit about how was Leonardo da Vinci's social life?
Secret, probably. In his day, although to a certain extent, at a high level, homosexuality was not encouraged, but it was kind of tacitly understood it was going on, as long as it wasn't flaunted in your face kind of thing. But it was against the law, and if a man was caught and convicted, he could have been burnt at the stake. And Leonardo had a very nasty experience when he was 24 years old. He and a few other lads were basically arrested for sodomy, and they spent must have been sweating, and absolutely terrified in jail. And eventually they got out because one of the lads was very highly placed, and his father basically got them out. But Leonardo knew that his life had been in the balance. Not only his life, but his reputation, which meant a lot to him, and his legacy would never have happened. And so after that, I think he was extremely careful about his private life. But he was the life and soul of the party. He was apparently, all of those people, whoever met him when he was young, certainly, they didn't say, oh, here's a very serious thinker, They said, here's a gorgeous young man, very fashionable and very funny. Now, this is not what, when you're at school, you hear about Leonardo. You don't learn that he was, a really funny guy. And he was seriously cool, It was seriously cool. But also he was a conjurer. So he could, sit at a table, and if people were feeling a bit down, he'd, pull a gold egg out of somebody's ear, and, suddenly the mood changed. He would make riddles up and tell jokes, and do special effects and build robots that did extraordinary things. So basically, he was not only the life and soul of the party, but he was the center of the party, because he was the one who provided the entertainment. But the thing is, he had this extraordinary gift for being able to get on with people of all social class. So he could get on with the lowest of the low. Maybe he mixed with them for rough trade, who knows? But he certainly used a lot of the people he mixed with in the dives for sketches of interesting faces. But he also mixed with the rising class, and he mixed with the upper classes. And he had patrons in the very top of society. And he was equally at home with all of those people who felt that he belonged with them, which is an extraordinary talent.
And very unusual for the society he was in, which was very kind of hierarchical and structured. And, the social mobility just didn't happen. You stayed in the class you were born into. So this fact, as Lynn said, he could mix with and make himself acceptable to everything from the bottom, eventually to the court of kings. Showed a great grasp of psychology, But talking about other things that he challenged social norms, just sometimes in ways that don't seem that surprising today, but at the time were. the fact he was a vegetarian.
Yes, he's
Now,
a fellow vegetarian and a fellow dragon lover as well. So,
yeah,
except as you say, that was quite against dogma back in the day.
yeah. Well, no, it was worse than that. Strangely enough, I mean, it's a very bizarre concept to get our head around today, but to actually be a vegetarian was a sign of kind of heresy, really, wasn't it?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. Blasphemy.
Blasphemy, yeah, because the Bible more or less ordered people to eat meat, and by going against that, you were kind of going against God's word. A very strange concept to get our head around now, but so even a simple thing like that, he was. I mean, he was a great animal lover as well. He would do things like, when he went to a market and they had birds for sale in cages, he would buy them and open the cages and let them free. So, I don't know, animal loving probably wasn't that, it wasn't exactly blasphemy then, but it was still very unusual to go to that length. He was left-handed, which that was normally kind of beaten out of you at school. And it was in Britain until what?
The 50s, the 60s?
The 1950s.
Yeah.
But back then it was more than that, more than just unusual. It was, our word sinister comes from left-handed.
Yeah.
So
another heretical thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
To actually do that, you're kind of suspect of being under the devil's kind of sway. So even in the little things in his life, he didn't conform. This is the paradox. He didn't conform in so many ways, and yet he could make himself acceptable across the board. Yeah. In other words, by conforming. It's very strange.
And also the interesting thing, what drove him, what he never forgot, ever, was that he was illegitimate. And this meant that he couldn't, for example, go to university, which might have coloured his view about, because he was an academic hater pretty much. But on the other hand, he thought that they were rubbish. But he, it coloured his thinking, and it drove him to basically end his day a friend and confidant of a great king, a French king. I don't think you could really call him manipulative in a sly and unpleasant way, but it's the whole, he was so driven. He was driven because of his talent. He was driven to make his talent known. And, in those days you had to have patrons in order to do it. So you had to mix with the upper classes. So basically he made sure that he mixed with the upper classes. So in that sense, he was manipulative. But I think underlying everything he did, everything he did was the knowledge that he started life with a huge disadvantage.
Walter Isaacson has a way of reframing that, and he's one of the many who did biographies, like Leonardo da Vinci, who wrote his biography. And Walter Isaacson says that that was actually his luck, because by being illegitimate, he didn't have to be a notary like his father. He didn't have to be sort of like constipated by the medieval way of academia and all this thinking. And he had the freedom to be self-taught and to pursue his careers, because he had more than one. So that was his way of reframing this huge disadvantage that was being
Yes.
And the other thing, because you mentioned he was vegetarian, that was not sitting well with the church. He was left-handed. He was actually ambidexter. And not only that, he was able to ambidextrous, and he was also able to write in mirror. He would, which again, it's not a good sign when you're dealing with the church, to have this type of coding writing in which you write like you're in a mirror. So in some of his notebooks, that was his way of writing in code. And of course, obviously, back in the day, his homosexuality. But he also had another thing in terms of social norms, and this is something that you pointed out to me. Besides being a friend and a confidant to the king and to people in like high positions of power, he was also a friend and confidant of women.
Yes. Yes. Mm. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's an element of, the gay best friend, which is kind of a modern thing, though, I suppose. But maybe there was an element of that, but only a tiny element. But yes, he did have female friends, I mean, proper friends, which in those days was not a thing. It was either a sexual relationship or it wasn't a relationship, I mean, an acquaintanceship. But Leonardo encouraged the friendship of women. And he seemed genuinely interested in what they had to say. He saw them very much as people in their own right, and not just, adjuncts or property of their fathers or husbands. And he seemed to have sympathy with them.
Yeah, and I think he also seemed to like painting women better. I think more of his portraits are of women. Okay, that was often because he was commissioned to do it, but also like some of his sketches and things that he would just do of women around him that he just liked the look of. But he certainly liked to be around intelligent women, the poetesses, people like that. So yeah, I mean, there's so many ways you could call him modern, which I think is a lot of the reason for his appeal to people today that continues, apart from the fact he also did just amazing things as well. But you can kind of relate to him on a modern sense in a way that some of the artists of his day were people of their day and sort of stuck in that way. They're hard to relate to, but you can relate to Leonardo.
Also, of course, he was so cool and so gorgeous to be with. He was he could be the talk of the town. If you walked out with Leonardo, even if it wasn't a sexual relationship, there he was with his long auburn curls and his particularly short tunic showing off his fabulous legs.
A rose-colored
tunic, yes, yes.
Because we all think of him from the one definite self-portrait from the end of his life with the long hair and the long beard, looking like the magus or the prophet. That's kind of the image that sticks in our mind. But for most of his life, he was, as Lynn said, cool. He dressed cool. He loved horses and riding fast on horses, which has been pointed out. That's the equivalent of having a sports car and that type, So a really cool guy.
Yeah.
Again, a very different image than, and I think that's because also when it's taught in school or when people start speaking in academic circles, like conferences and all that about Leonardo, and I'm saying people as in general, not all people. One of the first things you see is the self-portrait with him as the old man, the old Leonardo, and that creates an image that is very different to his actual persona. And as you said, he was a cool guy, pretty much, and he got away with a lot of things that were not just controversial or unorthodox in his time. It was part of his magic and part of his power to be able to do that. So I would like to speak now a little bit about Leonardo the scientist, because he had a number of inventions that were so ahead. And again, when I said inventions, I'm talking about sketches and drawings that he would have in his notebooks. And I think there are more than 6,000 pages now of objects and devices that we do have nowadays, but he was envisioning like 500 years ago. And he was also a great observer of nature. For him, there was no, like he would observe nature in order to understand its laws, in order to build this. And again, the devices are from like weapons to, we will see some very cool things that one can use, including like flying objects and all that. And one of the things that I want to mention, because it's so odd to me, and this is like a personal thing, but it's my podcast, so I'm allowed. I find that nowadays we still have this very skewed perception. I mean, some people have this very skewed perception of art being completely divorced and separated from science. And this is something that I, as a scientist, I really don't understand, especially when you have people who believe that art is having a monopoly on creativity, if you will. This happens to me quite often. I can say that people ask what I do, and I say that I'm a scientist, and they get back to me with, "Oh, I thought you look like you would do something creative, like you're an artist." And I think that's still a prejudice, but I think it kind of like it sounds good if you say that you look creative rather than you don't look like a scientist, pretty much. And when people say that I look like I do something creative, I tell them, yes, I'm a scientist, and it rarely lands. And I was thinking about it's so common. It's even ironic when this happens in places like Hollywood, because you'd expect that it's so.
Yeah.
When you're working in the movie industry and you have blockbusters with enormous budget spent on special effects, that you wouldn't see it as a divorce between where creativity basically was sent to art and completely removed from science. I mean, to think about culture without thinking about
to be in Hollywood.
Oh yeah, it would. Yeah, Leonardo would have loved Hollywood.
That
Yeah.
puts it all together.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to think of sculpture without thinking about geometry and physics, and to think of music without thinking about like mechanics and mathematics, it's so odd to me. So personal rant, aside, one of the things that I think about, and one of the people that I think about, is actually Leonardo da Vinci, and I muse about. Because again, it's this perception that scientists nowadays were like glorified measurers of boring objects, which is something that I can call a few artists. I too can call them that. Leonardo we have hints like how his reply would be, right? Because when he thought about himself, he didn't think of himself as a painter or an artist. And we have evidence of that in when he tries to sell himself, so to say, to the Duke of Milan, right? You were mentioning that in one of your Patreon features when you talk about Leonardo da Vinci, not the Messiah, but Naughty Boy. When he tries to, when he is sent to the Duke of Milan, presumably because he won a competition in music, he was playing the lute and won a particular one that he designed himself to look like a horse's head, right?
Yes, another side of it we never ever think about, that he was a musician.
An award-winning musician. Yeah. An award-winning musician.
So anyway, sorry.
No, I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that he presented himself as being a military engineer and designer And only at the end of the list, he mentions sculpture and painting as his.
That's it. That was his, it's kind of like his CV to try and impress the Duke. He actually numbered his skills 1 to 10. And the engineering ones were at the top. Obviously, they're the ones he thought would appeal most to the Duke. But he listed them all. And in fact, his ability to paint, I think he put it as paint as well as any other man,
Yes.
wasn't in the list of 1 to 10. That was after it. He stopped numbering then. But it was kind of, by the way, if you're interested, I can also paint really good pictures. Because I think a lot of his life, he was actually trying to get away from being just thought of as a painter. He loved painting, he loved creating, but he had so much else that he was interested and wanted to do. And
I don't think Leonardo woke up one day and thought, I'm going to be a polymath when I grow up. He just was. And I mean, that's a terrible word, actually, because it makes him sound academic and boring. And he certainly wasn't either of those things. But he had what you might call a kind of aggressive curiosity about everything. I mean, everything. And in fact, even the things that people take utterly for granted, like water or candles, he was fascinated by and experimented with. For example, he built a tank with various sort of pipes going down and he filled it full of water and put millet seeds on just to be able to see how water behaved under certain circumstances. And you could see exactly how it was moving because of the millet seeds on top. And then on another occasion, he became absolutely fixated on candle flames, which of course everybody, used all the time because there was no other form of lighting after dark. And he just covered in notebooks in, how the air moved around the candle flame, how the candle flame moved, what it was doing to the atmosphere in a room. Everything was fair game for Leonardo, just the things that people took for granted or the big, big things nobody ever thought of, anything. He just absolutely had to know how it worked and why, if possible.
And tying it back to the artist side of him, he as Lynn said, didn't see these things as separate at all, and those two sides, if you like, the scientist and the artist, went so much hand in hand that a lot of him trying to understand the workings of the world, the workings of nature, anatomy. Anatomy of humans, anatomy of animals, was in order to make his art as realistic and perfect as possible. So he's using his scientific side to do his art, but in his art he's expressing the discoveries he's made, and the further he got through his life and his career, the more that side of expressing his understanding of the world symbolically in his art came out. So it's all in one thing, in his mind there's no distinction, and his art his discoveries in science are to perfect his pictures. His real discoveries are because he just wants to know. But then he wants to express his knowledge.
He said, I'm not representing nature, I'm representing reality. That was his big thing in everything he did. He got real. He wasn't an airy-fairy artist. He wasn't an airy-fairy philosopher, he was incredibly practical, and it was into the real world. He wanted to understand how it worked, and that also meant that he was absolutely passionate about psychology, about how people worked, how people were motivated. And of course, he would use that. He would use that to get his own way. He must actually, from time to time, I thought, oh, these people are such idiots. But And he was often quite acerbic about people, particularly priests, I have to say, and people who slavishly followed them. But I mean, he must have been very lonely, actually, when you think about it, because he didn't have another genius to talk to, or maybe he wouldn't have gone with another genius. I don't know. But yes, I mean, he was all about reality.
And speaking of reality, I would like to take a look with you now at a couple of pictures from his sketches, and see how a creative, inventive, scientific genius he was. Before we do that, just to mention that the pictures that I'm going to show were taken in two museums. One is in Florence, the Da Vinci Museum in Florence. And if you haven't been to Florence, or you're planning a trip to Italy, that has to be, for anyone out there, that has to be one of the cities to visit. It's one of my favorite cities in the world, actually, Florence. The other pictures are in from an exhibition in Rome. I think it's still there. The pictures were taken in 2022, but I think it's still there. The exhibition is at the Palazzo della Cancelleria, and it's an exhibition where they reconstructed from the sketches the objects, the Leonardo da Vinci inventions. There's another museum in Rome that's closer to the Vatican, but I don't have pictures from that one. So I'm just going to share the screen now. Okay, so I will start with a picture of the dome in Florence, because this is one of his first encounters with science and physics and mechanics. As he was the apprentice of Verrocchio in Florence, one of his first assignments was to figure out how to, and unfortunately I don't have a zoom in of this picture, but how to put that sphere, that ball, on top of what you see, which is the church with the dome. So this was one of his first assignments, to figure out how to actually do that in the church in Florence. And you can see now like a image of the church and how that would look like. And yes, he was having a fascination with geometry, and you will see later even sacred geometry. This is from the museum in Florence. It's Florence is so overwhelming when it comes to culture and architecture and art that we almost missed this museum. Is on a side street. We just passed by it, and we saw the Vitruvian Man in the window, and we figured out that this is actually the museum where they have all these things reconstructed.
The bike.
Yeah.
Bike.
The bicycle.
Not just the bicycle, coming up with a two-wheeled transport device. It's the gear and chain mechanism, the pedals to turn it, which, when bicycles were actually, officially invented, became a thing in the being the 1800s or the early 1900s. When the first bicycles, you had to sort of skate them along with your feet. They didn't think of the pedals for a long time. And Leonardo gets there in one go.
Yeah.
And just, it's just a curiosity. I mean, he never sort of like marketed the thing, it's just absolutely it's probably, say, the most amazing of his inventions. Because it's so simple, but he got it,
That's one of the things where, in a sort of silly fantasy, you think, oh, maybe he had access to a time machine, because that is just so remarkable, as Clive says, you know.
We'll get to that in a second, because he had a very interesting thing with time. We'll get to those pictures in a second. But before that, I want to show you this picture, because this is his mirror's room in Florence. And Lynn, I want you to tell us a little bit about like that anecdote with the German priest in the Vatican, because mirrors, again, that was another, not okay with the church thing.
Yeah. Well, Leonardo had a secret room in the Vatican, which obviously must have been given to him by high-ups in the Vatican for whatever purpose we don't know. But we do know that in this room, he had a machine made of mirrors, which is presumably that machine or one very like it. And in order for the workers who were putting it all together not to understand what he was saying to his apprentices, his students, they were German mirror makers. And nobody knows what was going on in that room with the mirrors and Leonardo. But whatever it was, you shouldn't laugh really, I suppose, but it caused the German mirror makers to flee, screaming about sorcery and the devil and all manner of dark things. And as they went, they locked Leonardo in the room. But one of the things that is one of the many things that's extraordinary about Leonardo was he had enormous physical strength. So all he did was lift the door off its hinges to get out.
As one does. Well, we'll get to that later on as well. I just wanted to briefly take a look at this picture where we'll be talking about the art at the end. But Leonardo might as well have invented the pointing, and especially the pointing in the picture. And we'll get to that later on. This is another amazing invention of his. This is, yes.
It looks astonishing.
Like one on the left.
It looks astonishing, like a robot baddie from Doctor Who. But anyway, but yes, it was his diver. Yeah, Leonardo's. Yeah.
Up the stream. We're moving now to, so those were the pictures from Florence, and you can see they're poor quality because it was back in the day. It was 2015. I had a different phone. These are the ones from Rome. His fascination with also like sacred geometry and geometrical shapes. We'll get to that towards the end of the podcast. His fascination again with flying objects. And how to build something that can help him fly, basically. Yes, again, as we were talking earlier, the art mechanics, neurophysiology, the posture. So he was studying all these things, all aspects of nature and reality, as you mentioned.
Geology, fossils.
The
first one to recognize that fossils, found up in the mountains, were actually remains of something very, very ancient. He understood that the world was a lot older than the Bible said, which is something else. Endearing to just his study of nature, and particularly geology. He kind of, well, this, mountains can't be built in just thousands of years. You're
or
talking
7 days.
Yeah, or 7 days. Because he saw these processes that had, built mountains, eroded them, and it's. He just saw the world as a much kind of bigger place, bigger and older place,
and richer.
We are moving now through some of his inventions. There was that mention earlier on where I paused, where it said mechanics as an alternative art. I found that very, very funny to see that explanation of one of his pages of one of his notebooks. This is an interesting hologram-like movie that they have at the exhibition in Rome. I'm not going to show the movie of the movie. I'm not sure what's the copyright thing here, but just to give you an idea, you can actually see that lion that was sort of a bicycle lion, as in it was a lion that was moving. And I think that Vassario, who is his first biographer, basically, mentions in one of his stories about Leonardo that he would use the lion at parties. And after a few steps, it was a walking lion. It would disintegrate and it would be like full of lilies.
Yeah. And he actually used to encourage the ladies of the court to tap it with their fans, and you can imagine they go, you know, and then it would just explode into flowers. Yeah.
And speaking about time, that's a very inventive clock that you see on the left of this image. And I believe it is you, Lynn, who commented that since you mentioned Doctor Who early on, that he probably was a Time Lord.
Yeah. It was all the timey-wimey stuff.
The original.
Yeah, absolutely. The original Time Lord, Leonardo.
The original Time Lord.
There's one there.
Yeah.
Sorry, Clive, I didn't hear you.
He invented the Dalek. There's one in that picture there. They call it a tank, but it's obviously a Dalek.
Yeah, obviously.
He just had them fatter than they are.
Yeah.
The world's first Dalek. This just you just came up with this right now.
Completely rewriting history here. Completely rewriting history. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, we're moving towards his weaponry, the cannonball and the tank, and this was a very interesting thing to see as well. Oh, this is musical instrument, speaking of. Yeah, this is a smaller copy of the tank that you saw in the hologram movie, because this is like one or two people. The other one was like a whole army of people trying to operate that tank. It's another collection of like cannonballs. Now, we saw the other day when we were looking at this picture that this is actually, I saw that this was actually the world's first skis, but it's even funnier. We'll see in a next picture what that's about. This is actually that was about to walking on water. I'm just going to say it now. I'm not going to wait. Yeah, water is an element. And
although he was not the Messiah, but a very, very naughty boy. But yes. But you know, seeing all this, it makes me think, how would he have been with AI? And I think, well, he obviously would have been absolutely fascinated and just, you know, experimented, you know, really pushed the technology. But he would, I think, probably have the same attitude or a similar attitude towards AI as he had towards his military weapons, because he created military weapons. He loved the detail. He loved the problem of you know, of creating these with specific things in mind. I mean, he even invented a submarine. But he was horrified when he'd done the submarine, because he thought, well, this can kill so many people. You know, I'm going to withdraw it. He was, strangely enough, he was a weapon designing pacifist, which is, you know, just one of the many contradictions. And I think with AI, he would, well, like a lot of people, but being him, he would also feel utterly terrified about it and about its potential for harm. So I think his attitude might well have been similar to his weaponry. But we will never know, of course, but this is just my opinion.
Yeah.
This is one I post here because this is one of my favorite. The first time I looked at this, I saw that, like, this looks like a flying saucer. or like a like air balloon meets flying saucer kind of scenario. Apparently, this like other researchers think that this is the world's first helicopter because it actually rotates like it's a
Yeah.
like the blades of the helicopter. So that was another.
Looking at that concept, because the concept of flying, of designing something that looks like a bird and tries to fly the same way as a bird, you know, you get how people get there, but the helicopter thing, that is a leap beyond that, because you don't copy that from nature. You've got to have understood aerodynamics, which is another thing that he was heavily into, and you know, to come up with a different concept, not just trying to make a mechanical bird, you know, or a human powered bird. Yeah.
Same thing goes for the bicycle. Like and to quote you back to yourself, art was actually a means to an end for Leonardo. And you can see this his genius at work when it comes to inventivity. I'm not even gonna call it science. It's like he was visionary when it comes to and an architect and a designer, like the world's first, you know, visionary designer. And now we get to this his side of trying to understand not just the nature and the birds and like building the world's first helicopter and air balloon and how to again walk on water, understanding how to walk on water, and the bicycle and the tank and all those things. But now we get to his understanding of anatomy and his fascination with how the human body works. And I believe he was called at some point like the world's first human dissector. Basically.
Yes, well, one of the first, which you needed special dispensation from the church to do that, which he got. But yes, he dissected. He dissected dead bodies, sometimes immediately after they died.
Yeah, waiting for them to die.
Yeah, sometimes actually, you know, he sat with one elderly man who was claimed to be over 100. He sat by the guy's bedside and spoke to him as he died. You know, it all sounds like a very moving situation, you know, which it was. You know, Leonardo's not being sort of dispassionate or anything, but when the guy dies, he then takes the body. I assume the guy'd given permission before he died, and dissects it to try and actually find out why this guy died. You know, it wasn't. Obviously, the guy was very old, but he wanted to go more than that to study how the body worked, you know, and basically came up with realized that the guy's arteries had clogged up, just like waterways do. You know, he's fascinated by the way water worked, and he had that analogy. But you know, he wanted to know everything. Partly so it goes into his pictures. You know, his paintings of individuals are, you know, by far the most anatomically correct in the way that the muscles work and things. But again, he just wants to know how bodies work. We want to know what human beings are. And it's some, you know, extraordinarily you know, advanced things, advanced understanding of the way the human body worked that people wouldn't actually catch up with for centuries.
I mean, he understood, for example, about amniotic fluid. You know, the growing embryo. He understood that by observation, basically, that the fetus is being fed from the mother, and they're both being nourished by the same source, by the same food, which sounds obvious to us now, but it wasn't obvious to people then.
And combining his knowledge, now we're gonna move to the sort of the other part of the podcast. But combining his knowledge of anatomy with his fascination for optics as a field, we are going to get to the Turin Shroud and your first book together. I'm going to stop the share screen now, and we'll get back to it to number of pictures later on. But first, as I mentioned, the Turin Shroud and how perhaps Leonardo combined his knowledge of anatomy with his knowledge of optics and his inventiveness. I want to first ask you a little bit about the Turin Shroud, the history of the Turin Shroud, and how you then got involved into researching it.
Yeah, this is what got us into Leonardo. We came in from a very strange direction, and this is where we started working together for our first book, which has actually been out celebrating its 30th anniversary. It's in its 30th year now. It came out in 1994. Still in print in certainly in the UK and I think the US. So it's been around all that time. It's been through several revisions as well. It's the book of ours that's been revised the most because we keep finding out new information that makes our things stronger. So it's kind of, well, okay, how did thinking about the Turin Shroud get us into Leonardo da Vinci?
Let's start a little bit with the Turin Shroud's history. When did it appear first, and what was that about?
Right. Well, I think most people will be familiar with the Shroud of Turin, which is this supposedly the burial shroud of Jesus that's been imprinted with his image, and it's also got his blood from the various wounds on it, and obviously it's kept in cathedral in Turin, which is where it gets the name, and how long it's been around. This is a controversial point, but the earliest we can definitely say the shroud existed as a relic was in 1516, and that's because somebody did a picture of it. It's not a particularly good picture, but it shows damage that had been sustained by the shroud, which you can still see today. And before that, it's only a paper trail. There were only documents about this thing. And supposedly, but we'll come back to this, supposedly the paper trail goes back to France in the late 1300s, but no further than that for a start. And for a long time, the shroud was not, it's one of the many relics that came out of the Middle Ages, which was, a golden age of faking relics because you made money out of them by putting in pilgrims. So it was, and the image on the shroud doesn't look that great to the naked eye. It's faint, it's sepia coloured, it's red.
It's a splodge, really. It's a splodge of a bearded man.
A splodge, yeah, as it was known. But and then what happened was right at the very end of the 19th century, for the first time it was photographed, and obviously in those days, I was realizing there's going to be lots of people watching this who won't actually have the concept of the negative. But before digital photography, when you took a photograph, you had a negative image that you then had to turn into a positive one. And particularly in those early days of photography. So the very first thing on a photographic plate was they took the picture of the shroud and it was on a negative, and suddenly the image looks entirely different. It's lifelike. It looks like a photograph of the person. So effectively what the shroud was the equivalent of a photographic negative. So you take the photo and you turn it back into the positive, as it should look. And suddenly it looks real. It doesn't look like a painting. It doesn't look like anything else. It looks like an image of a crucified man. So then people start getting really interested in it and looking at the photographs. And one of the other big discoveries was that the anatomy is perfect. And the anatomy is, it's well beyond the understanding of anatomy back in the Middle Ages, if we're trying to think of it as a medieval forgery. And it showed an understanding of the anatomy of crucifixion. The classic example is that the nails from the wounds on the Turin Shroud, they're through the man's wrists, not through his palms. We always see the traditional way of depicting Jesus' crucifixion is he's nailed up by the palms, which actually is anatomically impossible because it wouldn't bear the weight of the body. The way the Romans used to nail people up was through the which is what's on the shroud. So, it's people began to say, there's a lot more to this than a medieval fake.
And speaking of medieval, there's one interesting thing about the shroud that I would like to clarify here, especially because it's also on Lynn's Wikipedia page. And I don't know who wrote that, but it sounds like intentionally confusing. The story about the shroud, there was a painting that was even before, like in France, it was found in the 1300s. And it's that story with even the Archbishop wrote a letter to the Pope saying to remove it from the church because it was actually obviously a fake. It was simply a painting. And then the Savoy family, 100 years later, managed to buy that fake painted shroud from I believe it was the De Charny. And the shroud reappeared, as you said, in like the 1500s back, except this time it was not the same painted fake, the first fake. It wasn't the painted shroud. And I wanted to clarify that because it might be confusing for people, even like reading the Wikipedia page.
Can I just say, before Clive explains, can I just say that we go out of our minds with this, because over and over and over again, people say, oh, you say Leonardo was involved with the Turin Shroud. Well, he can't have been, because the shroud was around 100 years before he was even born. So there. And you think, police, really? Do you think we hadn't thought of that? Do you think we didn't know that? Do you think we were such bad researchers we hadn't come across that medieval, the embarrassing fake painting? I mean, it's just ridiculous. We have dealt with that. That's a big thing with us. So, yeah.
Yeah, because the thing is, officially that is the official paper trail that takes the shroud back to that time. But as you said, up to the point the Savoyers get it, every reference to the shroud says that it's not just a fake, but it's a painting. And the one thing about the shroud, as we know it, is that it is not a painting. The big mystery is how the image got on there. And going back to that, the very first document from 1389, which is written by the local bishop, who actually says, we know who painted this. And I've also said that the Pope said, well, actually the Pope did say you could display it, but it has to be displayed as a representation of Christ's shroud. You can't display it as the real thing because it's not. So, and it turns up now and again, people referencing it, but they always say it's a painting, it's a fake. The Savoys, who are a hugely important family of the time, they acquire it, and then it kind of disappears for 30 odd years. And then, well, actually 1494, it's then put back on display again. in a place called Vercelli, which is just along the road from, well, exaggeration is like about 50 miles away from Milan, where Leonardo is working at the time. And from this point, from that display in 1494, everyone's attitude is different. They're saying this is a miracle. We don't know how this image got there. That the Pope in 1506 declares it to be the genuine article. It really is Christ's burial shroud. So, this new shroud appears at that point. Interestingly, that the Savoy family were also, Leonardo was very close to them. His final two patrons, which was the brother of the Pope, one of the Medici, and the King of France. His final patron in Rome, where he was doing the thing with the machine made of mirrors, was married to a lady from the Savoy family. And the King of France, when he went there, his mother was one of the Savoys. So, his last two patrons were connected with the Savoys very closely. And then, but the actual idea that the shroud is not a medieval fake, but a Renaissance fake, suddenly begins to make a lot more sense, because a lot of the anatomy of crucifixion, strange enough, was actually known by the Renaissance. It wasn't known in the Middle Ages. But anyway, what gets us into it? The other big thing for the people that believe the shroud to be genuine was in 1988. They finally got around to carbon dating samples from the shroud, and they found out that it's a fake.
And they did it also, they did it at 3 independent laboratories, like Oxford, Tucson, and Zurich.
Yeah. And the dates they come up with, it was between probably 1260 to 1390. The guy in charge of the Oxford dating said he would accept a date as late as 1500. But it's certainly not 2000 years old. Now, it was the carbon dating that actually got Lynn and I interested in the shroud, because the results actually came out February 1989, and we met for the first time in April 1989. But the reason we got into it wasn't because we believed the shroud to be genuine and we wanted to sort of find out if the carbon dating was right. We accepted the carbon dating, but what got us was that actually thinking about from a Leonardo point of view, his mindset is that the scientific view, once the carbon dating came in, was that it's a fake, nothing to see here. It's not interesting. But to us, and we kind of knew a bit about the shroud, it wasn't a sort of huge interest of ours, but to us, the mystery of the shroud isn't whether it's Jesus and whether it's 2000 years old. It's how the image was created, because it was as inexplicable with a 14th century date as it was with a 1st century date. So until someone's explained how the image got on there, it's still a mystery. That's what we set out to do, to find out how it was done and ideally who did it. And I don't think you need to be Sherlock Holmes to work out who we think did it.
It's a clue in the title of our book, actually.
Yeah.
That it was Leonardo did it.
You're giving spoilers now. Let's go through the process of how you got to that. And I'm going to start sharing the screen now, because I want to talk a little bit about the image. It is a spoiler in the title of the book, so
yes.
But I'm still curious about how you got there. So let's start looking at the image. So this is the image of the shroud as you see it, right? Like with the naked eye.
That's it. Naked eye.
You've got really to peer at it even to begin to see what it is. In fact, it's kind of the front and back image of a man hinged at the head.
Right.
In a line going across
This is
the middle.
Front, basically, and this to the right is the back. And I think I have a yes. This is the front, for example.
Yeah, you've got to really peer at it. Yes, there's the head. So and the arms coming across like that. And the strange four patterny things that look like lilies are in fact patches sewn on because it was in a fire in its history and it was damaged. So they're just patches. There's nothing more sinister than that.
And this is the negative.
Yeah.
See how it suddenly changes from just a blur, a blobby blur, to that looks real. That doesn't.
That's a scientific term, by the way.
Yeah. Blobby.
Yeah. But also you see that people look at that and say, well, it's got to be a miracle. It's got to be a miracle, because it goes, as Clive said, from the blob to that astonishing, very moving and depiction of an actually crucified man. And the face is so hauntingly beautiful. It's got to be Jesus, hasn't it?
No.
Not as such, no.
Yeah, that's the face.
That's the face.
Yeah.
There's some curious anomalies with that. But anyway, shall we come back to those, or do you want me to do them now?
Well, I can be the devil's advocate here for this picture. So at first people look at the negative image of the shroud, right? And realize that there's a hint on how the
people used to say it behaves just like a photograph, but we don't know how the image got up there. And so there is actually a bit of a clue there. If it behaves like a photograph, maybe that's what it is.
Yes, no matter how outrageous it might sound, historically speaking, but there is a clue there. Yeah.
So our thought was, is it actually possible to have created an image like that, a photographic image, using materials and technology that were around, well, we could say in the Renaissance. We're not looking to the Middle Ages. Yes, it is. We've this is going back to the early 1990s now. We actually set ourselves.
Before you go to that, Clive, sorry. Yeah. So before you go to how it is possible, on this image per se, because again, when people realize this is not a painting, right? There were a couple of other theories floated out there. One was that the heat from the body, or a certain type of odd radiation, was imprinted on the cloth, and then they looked again with UV at the cloth, and they realized, no, this is not made by heat or by any other such process. But then people looked at the image, and for example, when I said I'm going to be a little bit of the devil's advocate here, it's Dr. Fritz Zuckerberg, who was a forensic pathologist, and he was looking at this image and said, well, it has the markings of someone who actually has been crucified, because look at you have the crown of thorns, and then it was beaten up, and you have the bones here swollen, and the nose has been broken, and the proof is in the pudding, as they say, because you show that that's actually an artifact from how it was actually made. But this is to show that there were different ideas on how it was made, and also the thing with the face being imprinted on the cloth. There's another Dr. Emily Craig, who's a forensic anthropologist, who pointed out that if that was to happen, if you put a cloth on the face of a human and you remove it, you'd realize that the face is going to be distorted. Basically, the image is going to be
bloated.
Much wider than that. So,
well, basically, this cloth never wrapped a body. It couldn't possibly have wrapped a body.
That was an important recognition for us when we first got into this. Because I think, you are thinking, could the carbon dating be wrong? But then that realization that however the image was made, the cloth had to have been absolutely flat at the time. It couldn't have wrapped a body. It's not, the distortion of the face is one thing, but whether it was chemicals, there was a theory that it was spices and things that anointed the body that caused a chemical reaction with the cloth, but the chemical reaction only go up or down. It doesn't go sideways. You should be able to see the side of the body, the side of the legs and so on. So the cloth had to have been absolutely flat. And then once you got into that, there were various other giveaways. For example, that the front and the back images don't actually match up, even though they're supposed to be made at the same time.
At the front, the face is like that, and the back it's like, the head's like that.
Yeah. And there are although the wounds are perfect in many respects, in the way the blood flows and things, too perfect for medieval art, but there are sort of giveaways that it's there also to be seen. The big one is you can see the wounds from the crown of thorns through the hair. I mean, how does that work? How does the blood, why isn't the hair just matted? How comes you can actually see the shape of the actual wounds coming out from the thorn prick? So it's one of those things. It's slightly too perfect. It was done for artistic display. So,
but it's not a painting.
Yeah, and the other thing is it's not a painting because they've the image is not made up of pigment. I mean, pigment has been detected on the cloth, but it's been around paintings for a long time. It's not the reason you can see an image isn't because it's made up with pigment or dye or anything like that. So we're looking for somebody, basically, it behaves like a photograph because that's what it is. Is it possible to actually create a photograph, using those materials? We found out, yes, it was. We're not the only ones that have done it, incidentally. So we're looking for somebody then that is able to, who's around in the 1490s in Italy, who is able to come up with a technique that is way ahead of their time. It's got to be somebody that's a really good anatomist.
Let's think. Actually,
it's got to be someone that's really fascinated by optics, understands the workings of these things.
The thing was, at the time, despite the carbon dating, there were, and they still are, but there were at that time an enormous number of what were called the Shroudies, the people who still passionately believed it was Jesus's shroud. They themselves came out with lines like, if it was a fake, and of course we don't believe it's a fake, but if it was a fake, it could only have been created by some obscure Leonardo. And with lots and lots of quotes like that. So we set ourselves what sounded like a ludicrously ambitious task to find out not only how the Turin Shroud was created, but who had created it. And we thought, well, we might as well start by eliminating Leonardo himself, because he was basically, everybody mentioned him as as the standard genius, who only he could have done it, but of course it's not a fake. So to us, of course, it was a fake. Let's look at whether he did it. And we very rapidly decided not to cross him off our list, but instead to underline it and say, well, actually, yeah, he did it, because at the time the circumstantial evidence was just too overwhelming.
Well, we know that he was already fascinated with optics, and he was also fascinated with anatomy. And Lynn, you said it when we were looking at the pictures the first time, that he was fascinated with perception.
Yes, two sorts of two sorts of perception. We know from his drawings, and so much of what he was about, visual perception, how we see things. But secondly, and at least equal weight to him, was psychological perception. What we see is not necessarily what is there, or we miss, subliminal messages or what have you. And he could manipulate both of those. He could manipulate what we actually see, and he could manipulate our psychological perception. And he did. I mean, he did all that. Yeah.
So now we're coming to the actual experiment on how did he do it. And this is you, Clive, and Keith trying to reconstruct
my brother Keith. This is us a long time ago. Fascinating days. Because trying to, basically we set out to actually reproduce the shroud, because people said you cannot do this. You can't. Nobody's managed. People still say it's impossible to replicate the shroud. They don't seem aware that we actually did it 30 years ago.
Well, the characteristics of the shroud.
All the characteristics.
Yeah.
But it begins with you had the image up of Leonardo's diagram of the camera obscura. That's the means by which you project the image, and the camera obscura is something that's been known about since a couple of thousand years as a sort of curiosity. It's basically a way of projecting an image, and but Leonardo is fascinated with optics, which is another thing that casts suspicion on him as being a sorcerer, because anyone that dabbled in optics and the projection of images then was deemed to be, potentially a sorcerer. The church actually banned working with projecting images and things like magic lanterns. And but Leonardo didn't just work with the camera obscura. He was the first person to actually work out how they worked, which is what that diagram is about, which is an important thing. And this is me and Keith. We made our own camera obscura and set out to just try different methods of capturing an image on cloth. Obviously, we're working on a much smaller scale. We're just working on a head here. We're also, this was us in working in Britain in the winter. So we did, Leonardo had the benefit of the Italian sunshine.
Because you need a lot of heat for the...
We need a lot of light. You need a lot of light. So we had to use, sunlight simulating lamps. And eventually...
Coming now to his broken nose, as we look at this image.
This is the thing with these are the first decent images that we got, and you can see it reproducing the photographic negative image, and obviously on the right is when you've turned it back into a positive image. So we've captured an image on the cloth. But using a camera obscura, particularly at a short range like that, there was one effect, and just using it with a very simple lens, not complex lenses like you have in cameras now, that we ended up with this, getting this circle in the center, which is effectively a kind of image of the lens itself. And we were kind of annoyed that we couldn't get rid of this. But eventually we thought, and just to make another quick point on the head, we think that the body and the head images were created separately on the shroud, for reasons we'll go into in a moment. So that the head image was created in the same way as ours, on a kind of short distance with the camera obscura quite near. And we thought, wonder if Leonardo had the same problem. And then, you look at that image,
Yeah.
and right in the center of the nose,
yeah,
there is a circle.
You see it in all
Now,
the
it's
images. That's the other
taken
thing.
to be signs that his nose is broken.
Yeah.
But it's a funny break that goes right round in a circle.
Yeah, that's the lens.
Yeah.
That's the lens. Yeah.
So that's our thing. And then the other thing, so although we say, Turin Shroud, the image, it's a 500-year-old photograph. It's a 500-year-old photograph by Leonardo da Vinci. But then, just if that's not enough.
Yes, if that's not enough, we're also saying that the head, the face, is that of Leonardo da Vinci. So basically, the Turin Shroud, or at least the face of the Turin Shroud, is a 500-year-old selfie by Leonardo. And if that, that sounds absolutely crazy, but it really isn't. It really isn't. Leonardo loved putting himself in his work. Like the filmmaker, Alfred Hitchcock always gave himself a little cameo role in all his films. And Leonardo was a bit like that with his paintings. He's in the Last Supper of one of the disciples. He's in the corner of the Adoration of the Magi. And guess what? He's the face of Jesus on the Turin Shroud. And, we say that people look at it and go, oh, it's so beautiful. The face is so beautiful. And if you look at these images on the screen now, the top left is obviously the Turin Shroud. Next to it is a portrait painted from the man on the shroud by a believer in the 1930s. So that is the face of the man on the shroud. The bottom three are images of Leonardo da Vinci. I think you can see that they're not dissimilar. In fact, they are very, very similar, and there's a reason for that.
And it has been shown actually forensically, by the methods that, say, the police would use to identify two pictures of being the same person, but it has actually been shown, those pictures at the bottom have been put onto the shroud and they do match up. And the resemblance between them, well, if it's a coincidence, it is a really huge one.
Yeah.
Given all the other evidence we had that Leonardo created the shroud, the fact it also looks like him is a bit of a giveaway. Yeah.
And there is another hint with him inserting in himself in his paintings, and this was the Mona Lisa and doctors and Lillian Schwartz, the graphic designer who did the research and figured that this is actually Leonardo.
Yes, I mean, basically, we don't think you can argue with that, with that split picture. But it would, there were various versions of the Mona Lisa, and this, we believe, from the evidence, is Leonardo in drag, presumably enjoying himself in drag. So that's almost a fun
Leonardo.
element. Yes, that's it. But also, I mean, there is a serious purpose, we believe, to this painting, and nobody knows for certain. But there's an element of the sacred feminine here. There's an element of non-binary here. It's very modern. It's very modern. And just whose eyes are following you around the room? People say, oh, Mona Lisa's eyes. Just whose eyes are they that are following you around the room?
But the case for it, the Mona Lisa being self-portrait in drag, basically, which sounds so outrageous. There's more to it than just, Lillian Schwartz did this comparison in 1986, I believe. But there's more to it than just the two pictures link up. In fact, we've written a whole thing about it on and more recent evidence that backs this up within the painting of the Mona Lisa itself. It's one of the features you can get on our Patreon page, so I won't go into all that detail because it's actually a very, very conclusive case by the time you put it all together. It's not just, they happen to look alike. That's the starting point. But once you go down that line,
there are actually clues. There are actually codes. I mean, yeah, it's a Da Vinci code actually in the portrait of the Mona Lisa that bring you back to Leonardo. Yeah.
This is, please explain, but this is also from like, you told me that this is from the filming for the BBC documentary Double Exposure. I just want to mention here briefly before you get into the story that your research on this topic featured in several documentaries, and I would advise people to check those out as well. So it's the BBC one, Double Exposure, is the Channel 5 one with Turin, about the Turin Shroud. There's a Silver Screen award-winning National Geographic documentary, Leonardo, the Man Behind the Shroud. And then there's the History Channel, I mean, just to mention like the bigger ones, History Channel, Decoding the Past, the Shroud of Turin, or a Clever Forgery.
Yeah.
We've been done a lot of work on this, a lot of publicity on this in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
We've gone to it so many times, but
well, this was us filming the images on the screen. This was us filming for the Double Exposure, the BBC thing in 1995. 1995, yes. And actually, it was funny because when we arrived, we were a little confused as we went in because the producer said to us, "Oh, be careful as you go in because Leonardo's up a ladder." And we thought, what? What's happening? But actually, he meant this lovely local electrician was called Leonardo. So yes, and yes, and that's
of course he was. Of course he was.
Yeah. No, that's working really, really hard.
Really hard.
I can see. Yes, hard at work in Tuscany. Of course, the Leonardo on the ladder.
Yeah. No, the reason they took us there, obviously, it's nice and scenic place to film us because they wanted to film us doing one of our replications. Keith came along, he's sitting there, but actually using proper Tuscan sunlight, and we did our best image for that program. BBC actually built us a proper Renaissance-looking box. And as the model, the subject we were taking pictures of, they actually gave us a bust of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and that's who we see there.
Yeah,
and it's the best image we did.
Yeah, I mean that's the image of I mean, it is astonishing. It is absolutely has all the characteristics of the Turin Shroud, the so-called miraculous, inexplicable characteristics. That absolutely. There.
Yeah. And so whatever anyone says, it's possible to make a photographic image that looks like the shroud. We didn't actually go up to a full body one, but other people have using photographic methods, not identical. They all use a camera obscura for the projection mechanism because that's the easy part. It's finding a way of actually capturing the image on the cloth. And what we actually found is there were actually quite a lot of naturally occurring substances or chemicals that were in use back then by alchemists and things that do the job. You know, it's possible. You just need a bit of a genius to come up with the concept.
And La pièce de résistance. Whose face again?
Yes, well, this was our smoking gun.
Yeah, it was our smoking gun. Yes, yeah.
With our, our argument that Leonardo created the Turin Shroud, because we had a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing to specifically kind of put him in the same room as the Shroud at the same time. And then I think a lot of people remember 2011, this long lost Leonardo painting was discovered. And it's called the Salvator Mundi, the Savior of the World. And we just thought, okay, it's a picture of Jesus painted by Leonardo, looking straight at the viewer in the same way that the Shroud is. It's the only image of Jesus he did that's like that. But they don't look very much alike. But we thought we'll give it a try of actually comparing the two and seeing if maybe they might match up a little. And what we did was we got the two images, the face of the man on the Salvator Mundi, the face of the man on the Shroud, made them the same size. And actually, in the real world, the two images are actually exactly the same measurements. And overlaid one on the other, just simply made the top image transparent, so the one below showed up, so that you can see immediately if the features correspond. And there's a little movie about that that shows this. And that's a Salvator Mundi. It's overlaid onto
the face of the man on
the Shroud, gradually made more transparent. And if you look, all the features match up perfectly
and rather spookily.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the face of the Salvator Mundi is a bit scary anyway. It's not a cuddly Christ, it's really quite a scary face. But as Clive said, and Clive did it. I mean, Clive was inspired to do it and did it. And this is the first time anybody's ever done that or discovered that.
Yeah. And the bit that gets me strange off is actually that the hairline, if you actually look at the inner hairline now, as it comes across, the two actually match up sort of uncannily perfectly. Yeah. Now, as we always say, this doesn't necessarily prove Leonardo created the Turin Shroud. It doesn't necessarily prove how he did it, but it proves Leonardo and the Shroud must have been in the same room at the same time, or that both are pictures of the same person.
Yeah, and people often say, well, why shouldn't Leonardo be in the same room as the Turin Shroud? He was a good Christian, wasn't he? He would have loved to. And the thing is, you think, oh, come on. Leonardo was actually famous in his day. He was a celebrity in his day. If he had gone and worshipped the Turin Shroud, or worshipped at the Turin Shroud, it would have been, in the equivalent of all over social media. Everybody would have been talking about it. It would have been used by the church as PR. But this is about a secret, intimate relationship with the Turin Shroud. Heavy emphasis on secret.
Mm-hmm. And there might be another hint right here, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed.
Oh, yeah. It's not just that, again, the two images look alike. He's left clues in the painting. We're just looking at the transparent sphere that the Christ in the Salvator Mundi is holding, which is that's a standard bit of the iconography, but it's very specifically a crystal ball. And we can tell that because Leonardo is very deliberately painted in these what they call occlusions within the thing. So it's meant to be made of crystal. And we think in his camera obscura he would have used a crystal lens. So that is basically a representation of a crystal lens. It's also in the center of his straps there's actually a lens in the middle there too.
Yeah, right.
And there's also, it's been remarked by one of the Leonardo art history experts in the UK that rereading him, he was one of those that actually authenticated it as a genuine Leonardo. And he says one thing, what gives this painting a strange quality is that the image of the face shows changes in depth of field. And he said it's a sort of kind of the change in depth of field that photographers are familiar with. You think, I think he's left us some clues there. This is kind of his confession to having made the shroud. Again, there's a lot more that could be said about that. But,
most talks about Leonardo da Vinci start with this, right? Ours left this at the end, because for someone who fooled history with everything that we've seen so far, is like history's payback is for the world to see Leonardo as a painter, which was, as we remember, very low on his list of accomplishments according to himself. And he has fewer than 20 paintings. Quantitatively speaking, he was more of a coroner, because he dissected more bodies than he painted paintings. But there are, I'm going to get in trouble for saying that. I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying that. It's a joke. It's a joke alert. Now let's talk about the quality, however, because this is not about the quantity. This is about the quality, and more on the heresy and the heretical hidden codes in these paintings.
Well, looking at the Last Supper, actually, one of the things that really annoys us about Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code thing, is that people say, "Oh, wasn't Dan Brown brilliant at noticing it's actually a woman sitting next to Jesus? Fancy him! Oh, was he brilliant?" Actually, it wasn't Dan Brown; it was us. We were the first people who said that. That's a woman.
That's very specific. It was actually Lynn.
Well, specifically, it was me. Yes, So all of the stuff. Well, most of the stuff. That in the Da Vinci Code is discovered in Leonardo's paintings, comes from us. I mean, those are our discoveries. And we basically did a lot of investigation into Leonardo's paintings, but a lot of it was intuition. A lot of it was suddenly getting the subliminal messages, suddenly seeing what he was actually trying to hide and then, bring out. And we began to discern, looking at his paintings, a very pro-John the Baptist leaning, and not just pro-John the Baptist in the usual sort of Christian sense, but in the sense that was heretical, because to him, John the Baptist was superior to Jesus. And this was overwhelming. For example, if you look in the bottom row in the middle, that's the adoration of the Magi. And it's a classical, it's when the kings arrive and give gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the baby Jesus. But if you really look at it, it's the most astonishing thing, because the kings are there with the Magi are there with their entourage, and they look dreadful. They're old, they're sunken faces, they're sort of clawing at baby Jesus. And they look decrepit. But there is actually a second group of worshippers just behind and above Mary. And they are young, they are vibrant, and they appear to be worshipping a tree. And the tree is a carob tree, which is a symbol of John the Baptist. So in this image, you have a very pronounced Johannite, that's pro-John the Baptist heresy. But also you have Leonardo himself as a young man in the bottom right-hand corner, looking violently away from the Holy Family. And, and you have people saying, yes, well, he did that because he was too humble to look in their direction. And you think, oh, come on. He did all that, and no, that would not be the reason of him turning away. No. Oh, now we have a very interesting painting here.
I can't look at this picture without giggling.
Well, I know. Let's laugh at the Leonardos. You see, this is the Louvre version. There are two versions of the painting, but there's one in London's National Gallery. And whenever we go there, there's always a little group of people talking in hushed voices as if they're in church in front of it, which is very funny. Because this is Leonardo's most vicious anti-Holy Family, if you like, anti-Jesus, certainly anti-Virgin Mary painting. For a start, there's a serious, the bottom half of it is the serious bit. and very Johannite. So you have, apparently, you have it's a story that the church actually invented to explain why in later life John the Baptist had the authority to baptize Jesus, which in itself is very interesting. But anyway, so there you basically, you have, apparently, you have the baby Jesus blessing the baby John, who is kneeling in submission, and the character with the baby Jesus is the archangel Uriel, and the character with the kneeling John the Baptist is Mary the mother. But I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? They're with the wrong guardians, because traditionally it's John the Baptist whose guardian is the archangel Uriel, and of course Jesus should be with his mother. So if the babies are with their correct guardians, so John with Uriel and Jesus with his mother, what is the reading of that? That is Jesus kneeling in submission to John. And that is the only thing that makes sense. And yet, of course, to people, good Christians looking at it, the brain skids on it, But that's the serious bit of the painting. There's something else that, shall I just sort of vaguely mention it? Because the thing is,
it stares you right in the face, if you ask me.
Well, it does stare you right in the face. But I mean, as far as you see, this is the embarrassing.
This is something else that Lynn was the first person to notice, and I want to point that out.
Yes,
it says something about that.
It does, doesn't it? As far as we know, I was the first person in 500 years to notice this, and oh dear, what this says about me. But yes, well, right. So one of the things that is probably behind Leonardo's thinking here is that this painting was commissioned by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception. So yeah, anyway, and to have all these rocks in the painting was totally Leonardo's idea, and there's a reason for that. Yeah. So yes, and it's, once you see that, you will never unsee it. We have presented this to conferences of hundreds of people, and there's generally two reactions about a split second apart. One is and then followed by hysterical laughter, or nervous laughter, perhaps, if they're believers. But I mean, this is the least religious painting ever painted, and this is all pure Leonardo. It's basically saying she was no virgin. The Immaculate Conception is not a concept I go with, basically. So it has a serious Johannite message, and it has a very unserious but viciously meant comment on the Virgin Mary. So yeah, yes, the Virgin of the Rocks, I don't think so. By Leonardo.
I called it the rock star picture.
Rock star, yes, yeah,
rock star.
Yeah.
So yes, he was hiding a lot of heretical messages in his paintings. And just gonna get back to seeing you, which was also interesting because I've heard, especially the academics who are trying very hard to portray him still as this very serious, almost again in their image, right? Almost academic like. He definitely was not. And one of the things that I mentioned, like, oh, he wouldn't do that because he was against the church and because that would be like a death penalty thing to do. I guess like Leonardo would be hold my beer. If there was something against the church that would not be allowed, he'd be hold my beer. And go and do exactly that. Such was his spirit.
Yeah.
That's it. Also, you're saying that artists sort of turn him into this serious figure in their own image, as you said, but like a kind of modern day intense artist. And also some scientists do the same when they look at his inventions and turn them into a kind of modern day, again, dispassionate, atheistic, not non-magical scientist. And that's not true, because Lynn said earlier that this key thing that when people at the time recorded in their diaries or in letters meeting Leonardo, the first thing they said about him is he's really good looking and really cool, really fashionable. The second thing they said is he's a really, really funny. And then the third thing they said was, and he does really good paintings. But the joker, the trickster aspect of Leonardo, he was forever constantly coming up with pranks, basically, and playing practical jokes on people and making fun of people and coming up with puns and jokes and and inventing jokes. That was the person that people met, which is probably the way he could move through all these different levels of the society he lived in, because the one common thing that people have is that they like a joke.
But also there was a thing in the Renaissance, and certainly in the esoteric Renaissance, for what was called serious comedy, which was kind of, it's like his Virgin of the Rocks that had the two parts to it, the very serious, intense bit, the religious bit, or heretical religious bit, and then the sort of teenage bit, which also was serious, but nevertheless it's very funny. So he was very funny, and he did spend an awful lot of time and effort on pranks. A huge amount of time and effort.
But if you don't get Leonardo the trickster, you don't get Leonardo.
No.
And very, very few people do. But no, I'll actually modify that. I think instinctively most people, generally do get it. That's why they're so fascinated by him. It tends to be the academics, the scientists, the art historians, not all of them. Some of them will also acknowledge that side of it. But if you don't get that, you don't get Leonardo. You don't understand him. And he was a trickster.
A trickster. Yeah.
So we covered Leonardo the trickster. I mean, we started with sort of Leonardo the trickster, and we're ending with his trickstership. Leonardo the heretic, and who turns out there's a very strong chance of being the one who fooled history for 500 years.
Absolutely.
Leonardo the inventor and the scientist. Leonardo the social, I don't know how to say, activist in a way. And Leonardo the miracle maker, because one of the interesting things when he was like constructing the camera obscura basically to create the Turin Shroud as we have it now, one of the points that was raised was, and again in connection with that thing with the cloth being wider if you put it on the face, like Leonardo would have known that, right? But he wanted to do it, as you pointed out, he wanted to do it in a way in which is striking. It is miraculous because a stretched wider face on a cloth would not create the same image. And I think you mentioned, Clive, that there's something that artists did back in the day in order to create it. It was called decorum, this way of doing things so they look
nobody would have taken it seriously if it had been this wide bloated image. That's not what people expect to
it has
see.
to be miraculous or look miraculous,
right?
He would have known that's what it would look like, but that's not what the punters wanted.
Can I add, not specifically about that, but that Leonardo pulled off two enormous jokes on history. He wasn't necessarily to know that he would, because it happened over the course of history, although being Leonardo, he probably did. One is that if, as we believe, he was the model for the Mona Lisa, he became the most beautiful woman in the world. And secondly, if, as we believe, he was the model for Jesus on the Turin Shroud, he became the Son of God. So that's not bad for one man, is it?
And he didn't have, I mean, he wasn't afraid to sometimes show his disdain for a certain character because he called Jesus.
He just rather dismissively said, a man who died in the East.
A man who died in the East. Happy Easter, everyone, by the way.
Yeah, oh yes, indeed.
Oh, yeah.
And you're absolutely right. So the most beautiful woman in the world and the Son of God, which is not, yes, not nothing. And he also had, now I'm coming back to my turf a little bit again, an interesting view of, I mean, he did some experiments even before Galileo and Newton in terms of physics. And Clive, you pointed out that it was this one line in out of context completely, but in one of his notebooks that said that the sun doesn't move.
Yeah, sun does not move. I mean, it does say what, yeah, obviously talking about it's the earth that moves, but it's not clear. And the other thing he did, talking of, Galileo, Galileo is famous for his experiments where he, dropped objects and realized they fell at the same rate to calculate, acceleration and gravity, the gravitational constant. Right? But Leonardo, 100 years before him, hadn't done exactly the same experiment of dropping things from a tower. He'd done it a different way dropping a trail of objects from as they moved along to actually work out how gravity worked, on how it pulled on objects, and actually worked out the gravitational constant 100 years before, pretty accurately 100 years before Galileo. Nobody at the time, he recorded it in his writings, but it was never published, and no one realised he'd done it.
Well, so, also something he nearly did, but didn't, sadly, 100 years before Galileo, was he wrote in his notebook, make glasses to see the moon up close. But also he wrote, and this is immensely poignant, I think, he wrote, oh, to be the first. And that is what drove him all, he wanted to be the first with the glasses to, and if he'd have done it, it would have been. But, in everything he did, he wanted to be the first because he was so legacy minded. He knew he was a genius. He knew he was unique. And he wanted to be known throughout history. What's wrong with that? He wanted to go down in history. And, in our own little way, I think we've done that, Leonardo. Yeah.
There's another thing, speaking of my other turf, that YouTube pointed out, which was on one hand, his enhanced abilities, and there's anecdotal evidence there, and his trance-inducing techniques, and how he would use something that would be very close to what we call self-hypnosis, when he would stare at flames or look at the clouds for a long period of time. He used that more of a technique for creative purposes, to get people to use their imagination. He would say that to his apprentices. But looking at a flame for a very long time pretty much puts someone in a trance.
Yeah, he did have what you might call extreme meditative techniques, and he would stand absolutely immobile for hours and hours and hours without moving or twitching or anything, just in deep thought. And he wrote encouraging his apprentices to do something similar, and if they saw a stain on a wall, to allow their imagination to see it turning into, a wood or a continent or something. And he was very big on that. And yes, it was a form of self-hypnosis. And it might have explained his kind of martial arts-like abilities, because nobody knows where they came from. He did, I mean, mentioned before that when he was locked in a room, he got out by lifting the door off its hinges. He also, to spite his great rival Michelangelo, once he picked up a horseshoe and straightened it. And that was when he was old.
On the block to Michelangelo.
I mean, but the thing is that, you know, he must have got, well, I say must, I'm assuming that he partly at least got these immense qualities of focus and ability to, you know, to focus his energy from his meditative techniques, his self-hypnosis, as you say.
I mean, another thing that I've been musing about is, you know, one of the other things you read his notebooks, and particularly his studies of motion and studies of insects and dragonflies and things, and he would come up with, you know, things of how, you know, the beating of their wings and things that, you know, modern biographers looking at him thinking, how could he see? How could his eyes see that when it should just be a blur to us? Various forms of motion are like that, and it's almost like he could slow his perception down so he could watch, you know, the beating of the wings of a dragonfly, because he would note in his notebooks exactly how they moved. And there's various other examples of that, of things that should have been impossible for him to see. But, you know, it's some way of slowing his perception, which again comes back to this, you know, his mental abilities, his ability to focus. That he did have some, you know, quite extraordinary abilities apart from his intellect. You know?
So Leonardo was a master hypnotist as well, on top of everything.
Yes, probably.
It might also be why he got on well with so many different people. I mean,
and why they gave him patronage.
The skill of psychology. You have to understand personalities. Different personality types to do that. Which is, you know, basis of hypnotherapy, really.
Leonardo. So we were going to end on this note with Leonardo da Vinci, the behavioral scientist and the master hypnotist. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what you're working on right now. And I'm going to go back to sharing the screen to show, for example, where people can find your books. This is your website. And as you said, Clive, congratulations, is like the 30th year in print for the Turin Shroud, and for another one of your books, Stargate Conspiracy, the 25th anniversary. And you can see here a list of books that you can, I believe, people can check them on your website, or anyway, most of them can be found on Amazon. And this is the, oh, by the way, this is the picture from the bus 11, from taking exactly from the Da Vinci Code. This part belongs to Tom Hanks. This part in the picture belongs to Tom Hanks in the movie, and this is the two of you in that scene in the movie, London in bus 11. So this is your Patreon.
That's where you can, I mean, you can either subscribe to, we do a couple of articles each month, but we're also putting some of the older ones up just you can buy us a one-off without subscribing, and we're putting our ones to do with the things we've been discussing today about the Shroud, about the Salvator Mundi, and so that we'll be putting those up. But
it's, I mean, though I say so myself, it is astonishing wealth of our investigations over the course of 30 years for the price of a coffee a month, you know.
Or as I put it, for the price of a pint a month.
So I would advise everyone to subscribe to your Patreon first of all, and try and get also the ones that you're going to feature in the shop, and that the previous features. And this is Lynn's Patreon, where she publishes her memoirs. Also, like 2 features a month. I can test that is a fascinating read. It's an absolutely fascinating read. It's a fascinating life to begin with, but it's also
there's been rather a lot of it, you see.
Yeah,
for a start. Yeah.
It's also written in a way in which I think anyone can enjoy it as much as learn from it, because there are some episodes that are striking, and then are amazing encounters throughout. I think we should, Lynn, we should do a podcast about life stories from both our lives and encounters, and we should do a podcast on the memoirs.
I think that's an excellent idea. I mean, the only thing is, will anybody believe our stories, because they're just so outrageous? Well, I mean, but I'm sure people would love to hear. Yeah,
I just stumbled upon the episode that was promoting the mascaras of Christ. So,
yes.
So again, I would advise everyone to subscribe to Lynn's Patreon, where she publishes her memoirs. And what else? I know you also are in a couple of television series in The Unexplained, in the Forbidden History. You both been in a series of documentaries and all this and podcasts on all these topics and conferences as well. You speak at conferences, so people can look you up for that. And to conclude, once again, like, happy birthday, Leonardo. Happy birthday, Leo. And it's another thing that's a coincidence. My collaborator, and who's usually in my other podcast, Joe Tabonella, his birthday is also on the 15th. We filmed this on the 14th, but it will probably be out just right after the birthday. So happy birthday, Joe. They share the same.
Happy birthday, Joe. Yeah.
Share the same birthday. And I know Lynn's birthday is coming up, so happy birthday. Hopefully this will be out by your birthday. So, but happy birthday. I just realized now that looking at there's another image, like a painting from Leonardo's painting behind you. So
it's a real thing, obviously. Yeah.
And thank you so much for being with me today and talking about Leonardo, the mind against
our pleasure.
Always love to talk. Well, love to talk about Leonardo. Love to talk to you.
So, exactly. Yes.
And that's our pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Heretics together.
Heretics unite.
Heretics reunion. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye for now.